that, I'm going to get started with a quick intro for a quick hello and thank you for everyone for joining us today. Every year or twice a year now, we're doing our local government sector days thanks to Municipal Finance Authority, which you'll hear Renata speak in a minute or so. But before we do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what ISACA Vancouver is, so that you know who's running, well, administrating, I guess, this event and who's running cybersecurity events locally. So ISACA Vancouver is I would say, local community. ISACA itself is a global accreditation for cybersecurity certifications. One that you may hear is CISA or CSIM, Certified Information Security Auditor, and Certified Information Security Manager. But however, here in Vancouver, we decided to take it up a level and be very community focused. So in Vancouver, we have about 60-ish different volunteers. We have monthly events that aren't not necessarily certification focused like this one, just events on knowledge to everyone. We have She Leads Tech events. We have a mentorship program. We have a high schools program. We have a post-secondary program, and it's all run completely by volunteers, which is why it's so successful, including myself as a volunteer. So with that, I will put a link to the ISACA calendar in the chat here for anybody who wants to attend any events. But with that, I'm going to quickly give it to Renata so that she can introduce herself, Municipal Finance Authority, and that is our sponsor who actually is making this possible for what, the last 3 years now?
It's longer than 3 years, but we had a slight break in the middle there. So
Yeah, COVID.
yeah, COVID. COVID is the answer for everything. Well, thank you, Anthony. I'm Renata Hale. I am the Director of Technology and Strategy at the Municipal Finance Authority of BC, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Anthony mentioned, we have sponsored this event for actually quite a few years now, and that started with me attending one of these events and really realizing for the first time the impact of cyber risk on our clients, which is all local governments in British Columbia. So the Municipal Finance Authority is actually a world-class infrastructure bank. We are created by local governments for local governments. And in addition to short-term and long-term lending, we also offer an array of investment products, and we focus on the provision of education around risk-related and financial topics. Obviously, that's near and dear to our heart. And we consider that provision and support of education to be the third pillar of our mandate. So risk, obviously, a major issue for us and our clients, but cyber risk, as we all know, is a big deal for every municipality. It doesn't matter where your municipality is. It doesn't matter how big it is. The risk is the same. So as we've developed our own cybersecurity program and approach, we have advocated for additional support for local governments in this area to address that risk and to try to find ways to help each other and educate each other in a non-vendor dependent, non-partisan manner. So with that, I'm going to hand you back to Anthony for our first presentation, and we're going to hear from him a little bit about cyber risk fundamentals. So Anthony, back over to you.
Amazing. So all of you probably took a look at the agenda. We have an amazing agenda today. I'm going to start with some cybersecurity risk fundamentals. Before I do that, I will mention, I see Rajesh. Nice to see you. You have a question. We will be sharing the recording. However, only the first session and I believe the third session will be recorded, as the second session will be a little bit more, what's the word? Conversational. And some of the panelists aren't comfortable having that on YouTube if they want to be completely honest, which is completely fair. You know, my presentation is a what's it called, slideshow that's fully ready. So perfect. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna talk a little bit about cybersecurity risk fundamentals. Now, risk. Let me just quickly share my screen and spotlight myself. Play spotlight. There we go. And then share my screen. Oh, one sec. Share like this. Perfect. Now I can be a little streamer. All right. Does everyone see me okay? Or Renata, can you give me a Thumbs up. Perfect. Oh, you guys can also give thumbs up. Perfect. Thanks, Ken. Okay, great. So first, what are we gonna today? The goal is to talk about what is cybersecurity risk. What is risk? How do you speak the language of risk? For some of you, this may be super simple, and you're gonna be like, what this, this is the basis of how I work every day. However, for some of you, this may connect a lot of the dots of how the business looks at your cybersecurity problems. So, first of all, let's get started. Who am I? Why am I talking about this today? I have about 10 plus years in the cybersecurity space. I've been teaching the micro-credential for cybersecurity risk management and strategy and standards at UBC for the past 4 or 5 years-ish. And I helped Vancouver Community College build their post-degree GRC diploma. I've also built a cybersecurity program from just myself to a team of 4, including implementing GRC within that system. And now I have my own companies that I do services and assurance for. So I've had experience doing GRC from SMBs for startups, let's say, all the way to enterprise companies with risk teams. So today, what I'm going to talk about is kind of the basics that works across everyone. However, once you dive into risk, there's actually very, very in-depth and interesting frameworks that you can follow and use. So I'm hoping what this can do is open the door enough for you to be able to go and dive deeper as needed or as interested. So first, a lot of people don't realize that cyber risk is contextual. Not all risk is the same. Different organizations have different ideas of what's risky. So in cybersecurity, a lot of times we have what we call the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA triad, right? And you can't have you want all three, but you can't have everything perfect. So sometimes you have to pick your favorites, right? What's more important to me, availability, confidentiality, or integrity? And so different organizations will have different risk profiles. So for example, a e-commerce like an Amazon will have very different requirements than, let's say, a healthcare like our Fraser Health here locally, right? Let's say our local Best Buy versus Fraser Health, they're going to have very different risk profiles, and they're going to be implementing very different controls. Cybersecurity is one of those things where what I like to say is if you ask 30 CFOs how to process a transaction, you'll get one answer. If you ask 30 CISOs how to do cybersecurity or what's the best cybersecurity layer, you'll get 40 answers, right? So cybersecurity is very contextualized, and this is where risk comes in. So before we dive deep into why we need to talk about risk, I want to mention one more thing about municipalities and local government that I found a little bit more unique compared to a lot of the other industries I've worked in and with. Other industries, if you're working, let's say, for an Amazon, right, there's one large, the company wants to make profit, wants to make money. And availability might be the way to that path of least resistance. However, in a local municipality, there are many different services, and each one could have its own different risk profile. So for example, the way that you treat the security of a water treatment plant versus your citizen portal could be very different, or your internal finance system versus your emergency services, right? And so you cannot put that all under one big umbrella. If you do, that's when it starts becoming very difficult for you to defend yourself, because there's not one way to fix. There's no silver bullet. As much as we want to say AI is going to get there, AI is going to cause more problems than it solves before it solves the problems, right? So local government or municipalities is a little bit unique in terms of all the different things that they own. And sometimes, depending on the municipality, you may have a municipality with an IT team of 1 that needs to worry about all these different things, or you may have a municipality with an IT team of 30 that has a full security team that can worry about certain things. So the way risk is treated between those two organizations is again different. So that's why risk is one of those things that is very organization dependent. And this is what we're going to talk about today, how you can start having those conversations. So I briefly talked about this, but can touch on this. Citizen portals, more about privacy, integrity. They want to expect their personal data to be protected. However, you go to something like emergency. So that would be more on the CIA side. You would think confidentiality and availability, right? Confidentiality one, availability two. Emergency services might be availability one and then integrity two, right? Maybe integrity means that you don't want somebody to hack the emergency services and say, go to this location when it's really at a different location. Who knows? I don't want to spend too much on this slide because there's a lot more I want to talk about. But what is risk management and why is it so important? Risk management allows you to make better decisions under uncertainty, right? So in cybersecurity, uncertainty is, what we live with, right? Every day there's new uncertainty coming out. Is AI going to hack me now? Like that's this new uncertain piece. Well, there's only so much that you can do as a cybersecurity professional. And this is why cybersecurity professionals don't say, hey, we're secure. I can secure you 100%. Sure. I can unplug you from the internet and unplug you from the power. Good luck running your business, right? But there's a middle ground of where you need to be secure, but you need to accept a certain amount of risk so that you can actually run your business, right? And speaking to CISOs, the number one role of a CISO from not necessarily a municipality, but from a private organization, organization that's aiming for profit is business, then risk, then cyber, right? So you can see how risk is basically that intermediary between the business and cyber. So back to this. Risk management is the process of making better decisions under uncertainty. It does not eliminate unknowns. It gives organizations a structured way to reason about them and act accordingly. So for example, if your organization says, how are we going to protect from AI, right? There's no right answer. But what you can do is you could look at it from a risk-based perspective, and then you can explain how you're protecting yourself and reducing that risk of this AI, I don't know, whatever you're looking at right now, Mythos, LLMs, Insider, DLP, whatever you want. But the core formula is basically likelihood times impact. There's a lot of other deeper formulas you can go into. There's a lot of very complicated frameworks, and ISACA actually has one called C-Risk that's quite good as well. That's a very kind of developed version and can give you a certification. But they're all going to come down to the basics, which is likelihood times impact. Likelihood, how probable is that this event will occur, right? So what conditions actually make it more or less likely, right? Sometimes those things are under your control, sometimes they're not. Then there's impact. If the event occurs, how severe are the consequences? So who is affected in what ways? Using likelihood and impact, you can kind of determine the risk of your organization. A great way that I like to explain it is you need to, I'm looking at our time and we're pretty good on time right now, but think about vulnerability management in an organization. You have a vulnerability, you have an exploit, you have risk, vulnerability, exploit, risk, and threat, right? And so you need to understand what the differences between all four of these are, right? A vulnerability is the potential gap. An exploit is how you take advantage of that gap. A threat is what is the potential damage of that gap being abused and what's the damage that can happen. And then the risk is the likelihood of that threat essentially happening, which is that impact, right? So going back, let's think of a house. And this is very core to understand the rest of the kind of the framework here. If you look at a house, I'm not thinking cybersecurity, look at a house. You have a lock on the front door. In that lock, there is an exploit available. That exploit is if you can buy a master key off Amazon and you can open that lock. Okay? So the vulnerability is that there's a master key that can open up the lock. The exploit is the actual master key, right? The threat is that somebody is going to burglarize your house. Then the risk is what is the chance that somebody is going to burglarize your house, right? And then you look at, hey, that threat is actually higher because that key is off Amazon. Or, oh, that master key, it's only available to the person who owns the key company, right? Then that threat is much lower, right? So remember what those four things are as we talk about risk management going forward, because that's how your vulnerabilities and your exploits tie into your likelihood of the risk. But we'll talk about likelihood in a little bit. So I'll touch on this. I'll touch on that later. And I'll probably leave about 5-10 minutes for questions just because I know I'm speaking a little bit fast. The goal is not zero risk when it comes to risk management. So no organization, regardless of budget or staff, can eliminate all risk. A great example is, let's say that I live on the 20th floor of a high rise. Okay. There's a risk that somebody can burglarize me. And I can go and, get a lock, make sure I have a, man or not man, what is it called? The person that's standing in front of your apartment building, the doorman, whatever, right? Make sure unauthorized people. However, there's also a chance that somebody buys some suction cups and climbs up 20 floors using suction cups and gets onto my balcony. Now, is that a risk I'm actually going to spend any time worrying about? No, right? So my point is that in the IT space specifically, that risk, you're never going to be able to mitigate all risks. Mitigating basically means getting it to a level that it's acceptable. The only way that you can get rid of a risk is avoid. And avoid is kind of the nuclear option. So I'll give you an example. If you, let's say you have you have users signing up, and you don't users signing up to a platform for a free trial, okay? And now you're getting abused by users signing up with tons of fake accounts, right? Or how do you avoid that risk? You just stop free trial, right? Mitigate is by implementing different controls, bot detection, this detection, until the risk is low enough that you've accepted it, right? So avoiding is kind of the nuclear option. In 90% of cases, you're going to mitigate until you accept. Mitigate until it's to an acceptable level. And that acceptable level is defined by the organization, not by you as the technical person. And then the last thing is transfer. Now, transfer, it's a little bit hard because you can only transfer so much risk, and usually the transfer is financial exposure. So usually that's where cybersecurity insurance, or for example, if you're taking payment cards as a municipality, you might, rather than implementing your own payment card system, you might be using a Stripe or a Canadian version, Moneris, whatever, Visa, PayPal, Interact. Well, now because the payment is happening on their platform, you're no longer holding that data. So you've transferred that risk to that organization that's now doing all the processing and storing of your credit card information. So transferring usually happens from the compliance perspective and from the financial perspective. Avoiding is kind of like the nuclear option, but in most cases, you're going to mitigate until it's to an acceptable level. Now, if it's outside an acceptable level, this is where usually you have to have a process to getting management to approve it. So it's not something, so you should not be the person that says, oh yeah, we can accept the risk of not having a firewall, right? You can only say, hey, the risk of not having a firewall is X, and then a manager will be the one that has to accept it. And in a sec, we'll talk about how to actually phrase risk. But just to understand, you're never going to get to net zero. What you want to do is get to where most or all of your risks are at an acceptable level. And it's always changing. It's not a one-time thing. It's a continuous process, which we'll talk about in a bit as well. So first, let's talk about risk identification. So usually there's identification, assessment, and then monitoring or remediation. But starting with identification, what could happen? Describe the threat of the failure scenario clearly, right? If a water treatment plant, something happens from the cybersecurity space, what can happen, right? In Florida, I remember there was an example where some hackers tried to add chemicals to the water, but there was a human that saw that the levels were off and was able to catch it before they were able to do any actual damage, right? So that the first thing you need to understand is what could happen, right? Payment card, what's the worst that can happen? Oh, somebody steals your credit cards, okay? Or is it just your system goes down for a day and people can't pay their taxes for an extra day? Is that a big deal? That's what you have to figure out. And then it's the affected system. So which system, process, or service is at risk, right? Is it your internal systems? Is it external systems? Is it certain, I don't know, your like what we were talking about, water treatment plant or payment processing plant, or what was the other one? Emergency dispatch services. And finally, the business consequence, right? This is where you can go back to the CIA, and then we'll also talk about impact in a second in the next slide. But the business consequence is what could actually happen on the real world, right? So on the CIA. So the first one is on the event is what could happen, but three is the business consequences of what will happen. So the first one is more like, oh, systems go down. The third one is more like, now we need to bring in our incident response team, our lawyers, and we're going to start fighting lawsuits. Or now, if our dispatch isn't working, the whole fire truck, systems, and I'm not well educated in this, so I'm just making things up here. But the fire truck systems might not be able to dispatch clearly, or if your 911 telecom communicator is down, now what is the problem? Not just on what can happen to the people, but what about all the staff that are actually running? They're just sitting there waiting. Is there anything else? There's a whole business continuity part to it as well. So that's kind of the business side of the what could happen. So the standard format is usually there's a risk that event could happen. So systems go down in the financial processing area, resulting in citizens unable to pay their taxes for 2 weeks. Or if dispatch doesn't work, it can result in deaths, right? And so once you have it in that language, right? And I think I actually have it right here. Perfect. So instead of saying something like there's a firewall risk, you say there's a risk that unauthorized external access to the municipal network could affect critical systems, resulting in service disruption, data exposure, and increased recovery costs, right? This names the threat, identifies the environment, and connects it to a real world consequence, right? The firewall risk is simply the firewall is the control that goes in and fixes this. So no matter who your CFO is, if you say, hey, I think one sec, did I have, no, I didn't have an example there. But if you say, hey, we need to implement this new firewall, it's got this new next generation firewall monitoring and app control and all this and that, the CFO is going to be like, great, new technology comes out every week. Tell me when the next one's out. Now, if you go to your CFO and say there's this risk that's, exactly what we're saying, that unauthorized statement, and maybe you say something like currently we're outside of our acceptable levels of risk, that would be something that a CFO has to pay attention to. But when you say stuff like that, you have to be very careful because you are putting them in a position where they either have to accept the risk, and that can be dangerous, or they'll push back on the risk, or because, is it actually that big of a risk? Or they'll have to find budget for that risk, right? And fix it. So when you bring that up, you put your management in a position where they have to now make a decision whether they can accept the risk or not, which is a little bit different than saying no to a budget of a new firewall. It's a little bit harder to say no to. Common sources of cyber risk. So internet-facing systems, always number one. Identity and access management. Not having MFA, number one. Like that is just always is how attackers get in. Legacy systems, if you're still on XP or Windows 7, even if you feel like you're in a sandbox environment, if they get into any part of your other system, that's going to be the easiest system to get into. Vendors and third parties right now, supply chain risk is huge. A great example is they didn't get hacked, but what happened with CrowdStrike, right? CrowdStrike went and took down, half the internet. If CrowdStrike did get hacked, that same thing can happen, and that has happened. For example, if you want to read a case study, look at Maersk about what happened with the NotPetya breach, and that'll explain exactly how bad um, a third party supply chain risk can be. Operational technology. So number five is actually much more, I would say, municipality focused in terms of, yes, there's large organizations with OT, but almost every municipality has some type of operational technology in their infrastructure. You cannot say that for private companies. For private companies, they only get to operational infrastructure if they're in a lot of times in the physical space. But in municipalities, almost everyone has some kind of operational technology that they have to worry about. And operational technology is a little bit of a different beast. Reason being is it doesn't run a standard operating system. You can't secure it the same way you secure your Windows and your Mac, right? So it's a little bit of a different mind shift. So it's a different type of process you have to run, just an addition of more difficulty. And finally, email security and phishing. This is always going to be number one. No matter how good your tools are, people will always make a mistake. And no matter how good they're trained, even the best security admins make a mistake. My best example of this is if you look at cryptocurrency, it's a perfect example. If you look at Bitcoin wallets, the Bitcoin wallets have not been hacked, or a Bitcoin has not been hacked. However, many times what they do instead is they hack the person, go on their device, take their key, log in, and take their money. Right? So they're not breaking into Bitcoin, they're breaking into the user. The user tends to be the easiest gap. And so email security is for a corporate, email is the easiest way to get into any user. So that's why email is always and phishing always going to be a number one threat or a number in the top six. So when you're doing risk discovery, what are some questions that you can ask? So first, what public services are most critical? What systems and data support those services? What vendors are involved? And what happens as the system goes down? These are a good set of 4 questions to ask to start your risk register. And we'll talk about what a risk register is in, I think, 2 slides. But when you're building out your risks, you don't want, like, if you go back to my example of that suction cup guy going up 20 floors, whatever, that's not a risk that you would even want to think about or put into your register, right? So this is why we ask these questions, because we want to start with top down. Where are the crown jewels? Maybe if let's say our citizen portal is relatively well off, it has its firewall and everything, maybe then we focus a lot more of our time on our dispatch service, because if that goes down, it will lead to direct, public deaths or something like that. Versus if your online portal goes down, the worst case scenario is people have to spend an extra day or two to get the information that they need, right? So that's a great way to start your risk discovery process. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more unique, is that there's a lot of frameworks to do identification discovery, and each organization can be unique to its own. So this is where I can tell you what questions to ask, but then to, figure out how many risks and how to structure them, that's something you're going to have to figure out yourselves and find your own framework that works best for your organization. And by the way, you can use NIST risk. They have not the CSF, but they have a risk RMF. NIST RMF, nice long read, but very in depth about how to do pretty much everything. So now let's get into the risk assessments. So in the risk assessments, there's basically two core domains. There's, like I was saying, the likelihood and the impact, right? The two main pieces. Now, where we're going to dive deeper into this is because cybersecurity can be seen as subjective, in the ideal situation, your business defines the impact as much as possible, not you. However, you on the cybersecurity or IT team, you are the subject matter expert that can help define or assess the likelihood. So, what does that mean? How do you get the business to define the impact? Well, let's take a look. This is my favorite way, and it's about creating an enterprise risk matrix. So, let's start with here, and I'll go back one slide. An impact should be business defined. As the cybersecurity person, it is not up to you to decide whether level one is a $10,000 breach or $1 million breach. It is up to the business to decide. It is not up to you to decide whether one death is a critical or 10 deaths is a critical. It is up to you to decide. It is not up to you to decide whether a system goes down for a week is a critical or a system goes down for an hour is critical, right? It's up to the business to decide. So what the business has to do, you need to work with them, different department heads, and you need to figure out an impact score. So you have this 5-point impact score, and you need to find out the different types of impact. So here's a great example for financial impact. Less than $10,000 is 1. At 5 is a more than $3 million, right? You might have a different section for all the different impacts. So compliance impact, reputation impact. You might even have, depending on your unique organization, maybe you might even have, I don't know, some organizations I'm now seeing, a climate impact, right? So it's up to you to decide, or up to your business to decide, but this is what you're going to be then using for your risk matrix. So once you have the impact, you as the professional then help score the likelihood. So, sometimes you can say rare is like, 10% chance in 5 years or something. You can give it a number like that, but you need to define your likelihood. And then you can simply go, okay, well, if we get breached, it's a 5. It will cost us over $3 million. So according to our business financial impact scale, that is a 5. So that's severe. Okay, so let's see. Severity 5. Okay, so that would be over here. And let's say the risk is AI. Well, right now AI is growing very quickly, mythos and all that stuff, and super intelligence, whatever. So let's say that it is possible that we will have AI attacks in the next 5 years, or maybe even likely, and the impact could be severe because the damage could be over $3 million, right? So that puts you at 4, 5. So that puts you at a 16. Okay. So that's scary. But then you go and say, well, we actually have strong backups. We have this, we have that. So if we did get breached, the impact, because our systems are properly segregated, it would only be a 3, which is 100 to 500,000, which is moderate. So now you go from a likely and moderate, so you go from a 16 to an 8. An 8 might be acceptable, right? And then the question is, how do you reduce the likelihood even more? Oh, is it an internal system? Okay, then the likelihood is less. Oh, it's an external system. Oh, then the likelihood is almost certain, right? Oh, do you have a firewall, etc.? There's a lot of, you as the SME figure out what the likelihood is, and the organization defines the impact, but then you can go in and say, here's the controls that we have to reduce that impact so that we can actually implement this solution, right? If we put everything in SharePoint with no access controls, then if somebody's in, they get everything, right? However, if we put it in SharePoint and then properly segregate by access and departments, now if they get in, they would only get a subset. So the impact becomes smaller. Paul, you had a question. What about consequences for your customers and business partners? That, so That is where you need to, that's where your third party. So when we were talking about vendors and third parties, that's about you figuring out your, okay, let me take a step back. When you bring on a vendor and third party, just so we're using Zoom right now, right? ISACA uses Zoom for presentations. If Zoom gets hacked because ISACA was using it and ISACA users' data was on there, ISACA also got their information still, right? So even so, you for any vendor and third party you're using, ultimately you're still responsible for the data that you're giving them, right? So then what you have to do is because you're responsible, you have to say, how do we mitigate that and reduce the consequences that something could happen? Or how do we reduce something that can happen? So first is we make sure the vendors are secure. This is where you see all that SOC 2 and ISO stuff as a minimum. Then we go and look at what is the minimum amount of data that we can send them, right? A vendor might be like, yeah, send us everything and we'll analyze it all and give you something. No, I don't want that. I want to give you the bare minimum that you absolutely need, right? And so the consequences a lot of times, a great example is Life Labs. It ends up just being lawsuits, right? So all you can, if your vendor get breached, all you could really do is say sorry and sue them. You still are going to be on the hook. Your clients are still going to be upset with you for using that vendor in the first place. So the only real action you have is, you can sue them monetarily, but the main thing you do is be proactive with the pre-action by making sure that you're not using these vendors that are vibe coded tools that came out, 2 months ago. You're paying that extra, unfortunately, you have to sometimes pay that extra dollars to have a multi-tenanted system because that's how they make money off enterprise, right? That's the type of stuff that will help you reduce the damage that a breach would do, but also help you cover your butt when something does happen. Say, here's all the things we try to do to reduce that risk happening. Okay. Where are we? Okay, so cybersecurity helps measure likelihood. So this is where I was talking about vulnerabilities, exploits. There's different things that you can do in your cybersecurity program to help reduce that likelihood. So, for example, removing vulnerabilities or having an SLA, service level agreement with your team that basically says any critical vulnerability on any external systems needs to be fixed within 24 hours, 16 hours, 4 hours, right? So what that means is that if you have that in place, then the likelihood of, let's say, an RCE, remote code execution attack, so basically an attack where somebody takes code and is able to control your device from it, becomes less because you don't have those vulnerabilities anymore, right? Internet exposure. Is your system exposable to the internet or just to the internally? That changes your risk posture significantly. MFA coverage, huge. Do you have multi-factor authentication? No, then it's only a matter of time until your users get hacked. Not because they're going to brute force your passwords, but because users will reuse their passwords on many different accounts. And a lot of them will use silly passwords. And it's literally just a matter of time. Endpoint protection. Everybody here has Defender for Endpoint, but take a look at the attack surface rules on your Defender for Endpoint. There's a lot of cool things that you can implement. That's these days just the click of a button. Backup maturity. This is one thing that I'll mention that I've noticed over the last year and a half. And you'll notice this if you start doing research on different threat reports. Ransomware has actually decreased for the first time. And the reason is because organizations are getting better at backups. So the only thing that when you get ransomware, you can easily back up and recover. So the only thing that you're paying for is the data. And there's never any guarantee that they're not going to double extortion or sell it to somebody else, right? So ransoming, because the backup industry has gotten so much better, it's become so much harder to ransom because in the past, most of the time that you would pay the ransom was because you couldn't get your infrastructure back online. And it was, or your company would be absolutely gone. Now, if you have backups, you can still keep running the company. It's just simply how you just lost your data and how important is that data to you, right? And then threat activity. So this is a pretty cool one. There are a lot of municipal organizations as well. I definitely suggest to take a look at the CCTX, the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, especially if you're a cybersecurity manager at a municipality in BC or Canada. And there's a lot of threat exchange that you can get that's not publicly available. That, for example, maybe a city across the nation might say, "Hey, we're getting this type of threat," and then a week later you start seeing that similar signature, and you already know what to do because um, you have that threat sharing capability. So being able to connect with your peers is extremely, what's the word, underappreciated? No, I don't know. It's something that is not used as much as it should be. Just being mindful of time. There's three more kind of topics I want to talk about. This one we mostly talked about, which is qualitative risk assessment. So when it comes to risk assessment, there's two main types. There's qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative is basically what we're talking about here, where it gives you a score of 12, critical, high, low. Quantitative is when you say this is a risk of $100,000. And we'll talk about quantitative in the next piece. But qualitative is basically what we use, how we use the risk matrix that we talked about. So likelihood and impact equals a score of 12, right? Sorry, for ransomware here, likelihood of 3 and an impact of 12, because risk times likelihood times impact equals risk. So 3 times 4 equals 12, right? So just by briefly looking at this, you can see the unauthorized access to Citizen Portal is our highest leverage risk at a glance, right? Now, quantitative. So this is the one that's a lot more difficult, but a lot more useful for financial professionals. So this is only possible if you have your hard asset value or data value. So one of the hardest parts is not the formula, but it's actually about figuring out, see your asset value and your exposure factor. So what is the formula? The formula is single loss expectancy, SLE, times ARO, which is annualized rate of occurrence, equals your annualized loss expectancy, ALE. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's go. Single loss expectancy means how much is that loss? My data center goes under and it's all gone, $100,000. Annualized rate of occurrence, how often do I expect my data center to go down? How often is it going to get flooded because we live in Vancouver? How often is there going to be a tsunami, etc. Okay, once every 5 years. So 0.2. So that means I am expecting to lose $100,000 every 5 years. So if we do 0.2 times 100,000, what that says is we should be spending about $20,000. Annualized loss expectancy is about $20,000. Right? Everybody still with me? So this will be a better example, actually. Asset value is $1 million. So your data center costs $1 million. Exposure factor is 40. So which means that every 5 years, it's gonna, I don't know, depreciate by 40%, something like that, once every 5 years. So you go 1 divided by, wait, sorry. I think the math there is wrong, sorry. Yeah, every 5 years, it should be 1 out of 5 is 0.2. Yeah, I don't know why it says 0.4. But okay, let's go back to this example. Sorry, because I think I got the math there wrong. But basically, if you have $1 million data center and your annualized rate of occurrence is once every 5 years, so that means it's happening at a 0.2 rate. I think down here. Oh, sorry, that's where I missed that. The exposure factor is not. Sorry, I missed that in the first piece. The exposure factor means that that's how much of it's going down. If the exposure factor is 100%, that means your entire data center is down. If your exposure factor is 0.40, that means 40% of your data center will go down. So that's why that 400,000 number is what we end with. And we go 1 over 5. So that's 0.2, which means that the annual loss expectancy is $80,000, which means if we're spending less than $80,000, we come out ahead. If we're spending more than $80,000, we come out below. So this is a better example of the firewall, a business case using qualitative risk for a firewall. So instead of saying we need a new firewall because it has better inspection capabilities, our current firewall does not reduce the likelihood of unauthorized access to critical municipality systems to an acceptable level. The current ALE we'll say is 187,000. We'll say, right? Because we'll say the firewall or the asset is 750,000 and 0.25 of it would be exposed or something like that. After spending $75,000, we get a 112,000 annual risk reduction, which means the new ALE is $75,000, which means we just saved $52,000 in risk reduction value. So this part is the part where I'm trying to keep it high level, because as soon as I start diving deep, I'm going to get lost a little bit. But if you look up the ALE equals SLE times ARO, there's a lot of really great resources, including the CISSP. But my main point that I'm trying to prove across is that if you can identify your asset value, you can, instead of going to your management saying we need a firewall because of better inspection, you can actually say, not only are we at an unacceptable level and we need to get to an acceptable level, but we will actually get a $52,000 of value by purchasing a $75,000 firewall. Right? So now the $75,000 ask becomes significantly lower ask than if you said, oh, our firewall doesn't have enough capabilities, we need 75 grand to make it better or to increase our capabilities, right? So, and the last thing I'll say is the reason why this works is because CFOs and financial professionals specifically, specifically in our case in cyber, a lot of times, even I've seen a lot of times the CFO is ahead of the CISO, like on top. The CFO understands this. The CFO is trained on risk. That's their whole job, risk and finances. So once you start speaking their language, a lot of opportunities open up to you. That was my main point of this whole presentation. But before we finish that, the last topic I wanted to talk about, before we also give everyone a couple minutes to take a break, get some water, maybe do a bio break, is once you've identified your risks and assessed them, you gotta inventory them into a risk register, right? This risk register will include that statement, the affected system, the business owner, the technical owner, the likelihood and impact, and then the residual risk. So sometimes you'll have inherent risk, sometimes you'll have residual risk. Residual risk means after your controls have been implemented, after you've done mitigations, what's the risk after that? Then we have treatment decision, which is one of these four. Monitor, I would say, is not really a decision. It's kind of like a do nothing, which is the worst decision. But sometimes you can monitor until you make a decision, because sometimes you need to research and make a educated decision. So monitor, I would say, is the do nothing until you have enough information to do something about it stage. Status, basically where that risk is, and review date, so when it should be reassessed. Now, if you implement a risk register, great. You've done a risk register project. However, in a mature organization, you need to have a risk governance. And what is governance? Governance is turning a one-time project into a continuous process. So you're making risk continuous. So what you're doing is now you're assigning owners to maintain this risk register, and owners to assess every new system, and et cetera, et cetera. Basically, whenever a new system is purchased, vendor is onboarded, Major vulnerability disclosed, incident occurs, budget decision made, critical system changes. These somebody needs to own this, review this, and update the risk register so it's continuously a living, breathing document and not a one-time project. If you can do that, if you can identify, assess, remediate, inventory, and govern, now all of a sudden you have a risk management process in your organization. And so, or risk management program. And so that's essentially where you want to get to, but that's not necessarily where everybody's going to want to get to, right? Some organizations maybe just want to, maybe a register that's reviewed annually is good enough. Maybe you have a full legal team that wants to be a part of this. So again, it's not one size fits all. It's there's a fundamental foundation that works for all organizations that you can build into whatever house you want, right? Every house needs a foundation. This is the foundation. You can go build a mansion, you can go build a shack. That's up to you. Either way, there will be you need the foundation. And with that, that's all I have for my presentation. There is a few minutes here left, so if anybody has any other questions, I will be taking them now. And in the meantime, I'm gonna see and where our other panelists are to make them co-hosts. If you don't have any questions, feel free to get some water, go to the washroom. The next panel is a very exciting one, and I'll let Renata introduce them in a minute.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was great.
Perfect.
It's hard to encapsulate cyber risk management, in a very short period of time. And I know it's something that we are working on how we present risk to our senior leader team and explain to them the details right now in our true confessions in our risk management process. It's cyber risk equals bad. And so we're working on doing that, putting some numbers to it and getting help with our finance team to come up with that. So it's always helpful. I appreciate you pointing us to some frameworks and resources and even just walking through those formulas just to get a sense of how to speak the right language when you're talking to senior leaders. My background is accounting, and I still struggle with that. When you're looking at cyber risk and the issues that we face, it's very easy to get caught up in the we need this tool now because
Mhm.
it can be scary and pressing, and you really want to make that purchase. So I found that
And the
really
sales
valuable.
teams are really good these days. To
Yeah,
be
no
honest,
kidding.
they make it look like everyone's got a silver bullet.
Yes. And you need one from each of them.
Exactly.
Are we ready to move on to our panel conversation?
So everyone is co-host, but I do want to give everyone maybe 4 minutes since we don't have any questions. We'll go off camera, off mute for 4 minutes, and at 10 o'clock straight, Renata, you can introduce Patricia, and then from there on, they'll take it from there.
Perfect. All right, have a great quick break. I'm going to go refresh my coffee too. See you
There
back
we
at
go.
10. Okay, welcome back, everyone. And thank you to Eric for staying. I found out about Eric and his experience because my boss was at the Municipal Insurance Association Risk Conference, and he was so excited by Eric's performance that he immediately put Eric on the phone with my manager of IT. So I was very happy to see Eric's slides from that and to see his willingness to share his experience. I think the best thing about this local government sector day is the willingness to share what has happened in a way that has nothing to do with vendors, again, to reflect back on our last couple of sessions, telling us what they can or can't do, but actually hearing from people who've been through it, what they did, what tools they used, and how they came through it on the other side. So again, Eric Good is the IT manager for the city of Fort St. John. And Eric, I will hand it over to you.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Eric Good. I am the IT manager for the city of Fort St. John, and I'm going to talk to everybody about our February 2025 cyber incident. To make a callback to the last talk, we were the goalie who missed blocking the shot. Oh God, please tell me it works. Perfect. Okay. So the city of Fort St. John was subjected to a double extortion ransomware attack. And this talk is going to talk about ransomware very briefly, then go into a technical explanation of the attack itself, talk a bit about the city's recovery, and then spend some time talking about the cultural changes we've made to try and address it. As a fun little bit of trivia, this attack occurred on my second day of work at the city, so that was good to go. And this talk's going to be a little different than one you might have heard before if you've heard this version. This is going to be more of a sort of exposing of our internal post-mortem of the event as opposed to the public education piece we normally do. So you're going to get to see a little bit more about how the sausage is made as opposed to, hey guys, this is what ransomware is. This is how ransomware works. You guys all know that ransomware is terrible. It's getting worse. Apparently not though, which is good to hear. And cybersecurity is hard. So as a little just summary here, basically we were a victim of double extortion ransomware attack. We're going to walk you through these things. There are two things that I cannot talk about. One of which is what these cyber criminals asked for. So I can't tell you exactly what the ransom amount was. The other thing was that I can't talk about what they're able to exfiltrate. Outside of those two topics, we are essentially an open book. So this isn't really to discourage you from asking questions. This is more to say, these are the two hard lines I have to draw, and you're more than free and welcome to ask about anything else. So the type of attack the city experienced was a double extortion ransomware. Essentially what happened is, and Anthony's covered a lot of this, so I'll try and be brief on this section, is single extortion ransomware is where they encrypt your data and then say, hey, if you want to get access to your data, you're going to have to pay for a decryptor. As you guys know, this has fallen by the wayside over the years because we all have more redundant and immutable and more durable backups. So in most cases, we'll just simply delete the encrypted files and restore from known good backups and call it good. To get around this, threat actors have decided, well, what we're going to do is we're going to post your data instead, and you can either pay to prevent decryption, or you can also pay to suppress the release of this data. And we were threatened with both. Concerningly, there's something coming out called triple extortion ransomware, where basically, in addition to the double extortion against the city, triple extortion ransomware will go to your staff and say, hey, your organization, regardless of what they decide to do, we are going to give you the option to decide what happens with your data if you pay us a smaller amount to us directly. That wasn't what the city was subjected to, and I'm very fortunate that that wasn't the case. But it is something to be aware of, is that they've realized that like a lot of large organizations are now taking a hard line and saying we're not going to pay. And to get around that, they're now going to the individual end users to try and get them to pay instead. It's really interesting to think, like, we were very lucky we had an incident response team available to help us. I can't imagine being at home and getting a call and saying, hey, your city lost your data, and if you want to suppress, you're going to have to pay us. I couldn't imagine being in that situation. So who went after us? We don't name the threat actor mostly out of a sense of hubris, and we don't want to necessarily attract their attention, but they were a ransomware as a service cyber criminal group. The people who attacked us did not have a personal vendetta against the city, and they didn't do it for any motivation other than they had the opportunity and they wanted to make a profit. How they operate is that they'll generally buy compromised credentials from dark web markets and then use those in combination with sort of off-the-shelf toolkits to attack organizations en masse. The startup cost for this is actually surprisingly low. The affiliates usually pay about $40-ish a month for access to the tooling. That also gets them ongoing professional support, access to private forums, payment processing portals, and tools and support for writing custom ransom notes or negotiating ransom demands. The credentials themselves are generally about $30 to $65 per account, depending on how fresh the account is, how high quality the information is, that sort of thing, which makes you think like this can be around $70 to $100 US. It's weird to think that we live in a world where a single grocery trip can cost more than what they need to pay to try and attack your organization. So what actually happened? We started getting calls around 6:30 in the morning. Generally I'm a fairly early riser. I've worked in construction most of my life prior to this. If you're not up by 5:30, you're considered late, that sort of thing. And the fact that I was already getting calls and saying like, hey, something's wrong was really not a good sign. Um, we had started getting reports from various departments that our systems were down, but interestingly enough, we weren't getting anything from any of our reporting tools. And it wasn't adding up because when we got to the office and we started really digging into things, it's like, well, all the virtual machines are up, all their hosts are up, we can get into vCenter, everything seems to be responding to ping, and none of our monitoring tools have actually said anything's wrong. What's going on? The big clue that something was wrong was then we started to actually try and get into the virtual machines themselves. RDP wouldn't work. Accessing through the backend through vCenter wouldn't work. vCenter wouldn't take any of our commands. So we would say like, hey, we're going to try and vMotion all the VMs off of a host to try and isolate it for testing. And it would just error out and say, sorry, I can't do that. There's a web error or something like that. We're like, oh, that's really weird. We didn't really have an idea what was wrong. And so like any good IT professional does, we thought, well, let's try turning something off and on and see if that fixes it. When we turned one of the hosts off and on, it wouldn't come back online. Given that, we thought we had a physical issue with the hosts, we thought that a physical issue with the host was unlikely because it's like, well, these are affecting all the hosts. It doesn't make sense that it's a physical issue, but we have no other explanation for what's going on. Let's go take a look. We popped out the SD card, which hosted ESXi on it, and found a ransom note. It's hard to explain the kind of gut drop that happens when you find that ransom note and realize, oh, this is the real thing. We immediately started looking at the firewalls to see like, hey, can we figure out what's going on here? We saw that a ton of traffic was moving out. And as we were having the conversation of, okay, this is actually the real thing, we need to, lock in and get going, our CAO came downstairs and says, hey, I have this nice person on the phone. They're saying you've been hacked. What do I do? So the ransom note was a fairly standard one. I borrowed one from Lockbit. Ours was fairly similar to this. They all come in a little text file, usually titled something like README or recover files or whatever, and they'll all follow a similar pattern. You've been hacked. Here's how you get a hold of us. Don't contact the police. Don't tell anyone. Pay us in Bitcoins. The phone calls that they'll also make to you are roughly structured in the same way. So it's something like your organization's been hacked. Interesting, they'll frame it like we're here to help you and we have really good customer service. We're going to get you going. Just make sure you come pay us, and then we'll get things going for you again. One of the best pieces of advice I can give to you is ignore this. Call the police. Call your incident response team if you have one on retainer. Call your cyber insurance provider if you don't. They have no real way of knowing if you've done this or not. They'll use a lot of bluffing to be like, we're in your systems, we can see everything. We're all cybersecurity professionals. We know that that's really not the case. And it's not like they've installed a wiretap on your phone. It's not like they've hacked your personal cell phone. Generally, they've taken data and they're running. So everything from this point on that I'm going to tell you is mostly based on forensic reconstruction and logical inference. There's some parts we're not clear on because they're threat actors and are not the biggest fans of logs that I'm going to say like, hey, this is how we think things happened. The rest of it is we were able to obtain logs and we know that this is exactly what happened. So the first thing the attacker did was 0 day into our firewall. We know this because we received an indicator of compromise email from our firewall vendor a few weeks after the event saying, hey, we have found files related to a unpatched 0 day on your firewall. Here's the emergency patch. You probably want to check for instance of breach. Once the firewall was hacked, they would have then had a list of authorized VPN users. With that list, they were then able to source credentials on the dark web for one of the compromised accounts. That account did not have multi-factor authentication on their account because they were supposed to get multi-factor authentication in a few weeks to a few months, depending on how the project rolled out. That alone will play a huge, big thing into how we talk about remediation. Based on the reconstruction, we figure they were in our systems for probably about a week prior to executing the actual attack. After they established a foothold, they then started to do reconnaissance. They managed to find a path to our VMware hosts. Strike number 2, we have a basic network segmentation plan, or had at the time a basic network segmentation plan in place. That path should not have existed. However, it did because of a temporary change that was put in place to try and fix a connection between the VPN network and one of the servers. Once they found the VMware hosts, things then went bad from bad to worse. Strike 3. A temporary change was made, and one of the VMware hosts had been reset to factory defaults. Factory defaults includes the factory or manufacturer's password. That was found by a dictionary attack. From there, they have access to the web UI, and we've been fully owned. They have access to whatever they need to do. They then found a domain controller. We're not entirely sure what they did at this point because there's evidence of two different attacks. One was that they dumped the memory from one of the compromised hosts and then took the cache credentials from a logged in user of one of the domain controllers. The other thought is that, and we think this is probably more likely, is they did a patch the hacks attack directly on the DC and were able to obtain a domain admin credential from that point. Either way, the end result is they not only have access to the ESXi hosts, and the ESXi hosts have access to the data stores, which means they can now employ their encryption attack, but they also have access to a domain controller who has authorization to go look for the file servers. So once they're in, they then found the file servers. They looked for sensitive data and then copied it to the logging disk of an SQL server. The reason why they chose the SQL server is because the SQL server really rapidly fills up with logs and then clears itself, and rapidly fills up with logs and clears itself. So we wouldn't notice a whole bunch of information being staged on that server. They then created a really benign looking folder. There was something like temp logs or something like that, and started packaging the information inside of that staging server for preparation for exfiltration. The interesting thing is that they use 7-zip, like a portable version of it, with memory and CPU restrictions so that the host wouldn't be overtaxed, so that IT wouldn't be going to look and say like, hey, why is this VM using so much memory? They ran it at something like 15 to 20% for the entire time, just to try and keep it under our noses and so we wouldn't draw their attention. And that's it. They exfiltrated via publicly available file transfer tools starting at around 4:30 a.m. and then ran their ransomware payload against the data stores. I want everyone to notice something at this point, because in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about culture instead of technical fixes, and this is part of the reason why. This is a textbook ransomware as a service attack pattern that capitalized on mistakes my team made. There's nothing really technically interesting about the attack pattern. If you know how ransomware as a service threat actors work, this is almost by the book for them. And so that's something to keep in mind as we go forward. And why is Eric not talking about technical stuff? That's why. So after we got hit, we then went into basically first response and how do we recover. So what's interesting is how they talk to you. Your incident response team, if you have one, is going to manage these communications for you. I highly recommend that you let them deal with this because they have the tools and the sort of language and vocabulary to be able to deal with this on your behalf. The incident response team will pretend to be you. In our case, they acted as though they were the CAO. But in general, the conversation was actually occurring with the IR representatives who were then relaying back to the CAO saying, hey, we're about to talk to them about this. Is this okay? What the protectors will do was basically a pretty predictable pattern. They want to get your attention, so they're going to call the CAO. They also literally called every other publicly available number we had until they got somebody to acknowledge that they had been hacked and that they were going to jump into their dark web chat. Their whole goal is to get you off of the phone and onto this dark web chat. Once they're there, they're going to ask for a payment of cryptocurrency. In our case, they're going to ask for Bitcoins. It's interesting because they'll come to you with one lump sum, and if you press them, they'll actually split it into two. And this is apparently what they always do. Half of it will be for data decryption. The other half will be for suppression of data. Your incident response team is going to be doing a lot of negotiations that don't really matter to you, because the goal for them is not necessarily to get you the most optimal payout outcome. It's to make them forget about you. You have to remember that the people who execute these attacks are often managing 2 to 3 new victims per day, and those cases can take months to resolve. They might have 90 to 100 victims who they're extorting at a single point of time. And one of the tactics is to try and drag this out, because if they don't think you're going to pay, and if they don't think that your information is really that juicy, they might just forget and move on to somebody else. They don't always forget about you, and in most cases they don't, but it happens often enough that it's worth a shot. You'll go through a series of exercises with them during your communications. So they'll send you a list of files you have. They do this to show you what they have and to try and like threaten and encourage you to pay. The next thing they'll do after that is a proof of life exercise. This is where you send them some junk files, and then they're going to decrypt them to try and show you, hey, if you buy the decryptor, it will actually work. To give you a sense of the timeline of all of this, you'll be in daily contact with the threat actor for every day for about a week. Then you're going to start slowly petering off. It's going to become every other day, then every third day, then once a week, and so on and so forth for between 4 to 8 weeks, depending on how aggressive the threat actor is. So our immediate response was to shut everything off. This is a difficult decision because technically interrupting the encryption process is high risk, as it can make it so that the decryptor that they provide you doesn't work. We didn't know if they had reached the backups. We had backups in place. We thought, no, it's unlikely that they've gotten to them, but we don't know for sure. And data is moving right now, and we have to make a decision right now. We didn't have time to wait for the incident response team because we had active indications that data was being exfiltrated. So basically, I weighed the risk of the decryptor not working against the risk of future data exfiltration and decided this is the least bad outcome. This is what we're going to do. So we powered off the data center, which shut off the transfers, shut off the firewall, shut off all the servers. And for the first time in what I gather is like close to 20 years, our data center is just silent. We then called our cyber insurance provider. The cyber insurance provider activated their incident response team. Meanwhile, we went to go check on life safety impacting things, the primary thing of which was the water treatment plant. Fortunately, our network segmentation for that was still in place and the threat actor hadn't discovered it. It then becomes a waiting game. Recovery for us was faster than we expected because we concluded that the threat actor had likely seen a complete manifest of our VMs. And because of that, they likely knew where our backups were. Given that we couldn't trust our backups, as we didn't know how long they'd been in the system, and we knew that the threat actor knew where they were, we decided the first thing we're going to look at is, well, what is the actual state of the virtual machines? The interesting thing is the virtual machines should have been encrypted, but weren't. When the threat actor launched the payload, they forgot to turn off the virtual machines. Because they didn't turn off the virtual machines, the encryptor script couldn't encrypt the virtual disks because the virtual disks were still locked by the hypervisor. So when we shut everything off, we shut it off with the virtual disks still intact. Instead, all they were able to encrypt were the descriptor files, which made them hard to boot. Given that they did this, we could just rebuild the descriptor files and we were good to go. At that point, we decided, you know what, we are going to have to clear the backups anyway, because again, we don't know how long they've been in the system. We might as well just conduct forensics on the existing virtual machines as they are, clear them, remove persistent footholds, and return those to service instead. This was significantly faster than trying to restore backups and allowed us to be back online mostly within the week. I want to point out that the attackers who went after us with a ransomware as a service group, and regardless of what I'm about to say, I need to be clear that I'm not bragging. No matter how much I might disparage the gang that hit us, they were obviously smarter than us and got the better of us. However, the fact that they forgot to turn off the VMs was compounded by some other mistakes. They were exfiltrating at the same time they ran the attack, and they didn't wait until exfiltration was done to contact us. Normally, when they go to exfiltrate data, they will break the data into buckets, and those buckets are then categorized by things that are really interesting, things that are sort of interesting, and things that are not interesting, but we want to get if we can. For some reason, they decided that the first thing they were going to exfiltrate was the bucket of least interesting stuff. When we cut the power, we cut off their in-progress transfers of the interesting data. That alone massively reduced the overall impact of their attack because they didn't have the most interesting data that we would have really wanted to protect. I want everyone to understand that I can be as candid about this as I am because the city got lucky. The decision to cut the power off was defensible on its own. I had my reasons for doing it, but I did not know that this would be the payoff. It was not a significant technical decision I made. I got lucky. The story here isn't I'm going to be a bit thin on details about recovery after this point because there isn't really much of a story to tell here. We turned the virtual machines back on and a SOC cleared them isn't really an in-depth transferable lesson for professionals to take away. It's interesting for the public. For you guys, you're like, yeah, we know this. This is part and parcel. It's something to keep in mind. We got lucky. Had things been different, it would have been a much different story for the city, and we would have had to have much harder conversations. So Criminals will give you probably a couple weeks to figure out what you're going to do. After that point, they're going to start ramping up the pressure tactics. What they'll start doing is something called previewing. Previewing is basically saying, hey, we're going to take a small sampling of the data we have, and we're going to post it to the world, and we're going to claim that we hit you. An interesting thing is that we were reached out by CyberGC a couple of weeks after we had been post, which gives you an idea that there's actually a lag time between when CyberGC picks it up, when they decide to notify you, and when the threat actor will actually post stuff. After about a month, if the ransomware actor thinks you're not going to pay, they're then going to re-ramp things up, and there are going to be another set of calls saying, hey, your management's not cooperating with them or with us. You need to get your management back in the chat. If you don't, in a couple of weeks, we're going to post everything. Generally speaking, about 1 to 2 months after the initial hit, depending on how aggressive the ransomware actor has been, they will then post all of your information and follow through on the threat. One of the questions we had was, well, do we pay for data suppression? And the advice we kept getting over and over again is they're probably going to post it anyway, so there's no point in paying for data suppression. I'm going to kind of briefly go over how what order we decided to notify people in. Basically, it was the general principle we had to decide on was, well, who can help us try and reduce the impact to end residents? So we notified our cyber insurance provider. The real reason why we did that first is because they are the people who also had our incident response retainer. Because of that, they were able to bring in the incident response team and brought on SME counsel to guide us through the next thing. Then it became notifying the OIPC to meet our legal obligations. At the same time, we also were right next door from the cop shop. So we walked across the street and said, hey, this is a bit of an odd one, but we want to talk to an officer about a cyber incident we had. It was really funny. The Mountie who came to talk to us kind of looked at us like we had two heads, because he's a beat cop, and he's like, so somebody broke in, and we're like, not exactly. They came in from the internet, and he's like, so they're like out in the broad somewhere, and we're like, yeah. And he's like, what do you want me to do about this? Anyway, took our statement, really nice guy. That then gets escalated to some of their internal investigators. For the most part, what they're trying to do is get information like logs off of you so that they can then distribute it through channels like CyberGC and all the other 3-letter acronym organizations to try and at least coordinate some information and share with like Interpol and that sort of thing. They're not going to go kick down somebody's door to go get your information back. Then we notified City Council. Most of this all occurred, with the exception of the OIPC, because it took a while to fill out the paperwork, within the same day. Once we notified City Council, we then notified the public and said, hey, there's been a cyber incident. I am forever grateful that Milo, our CAO, is one of the most honest and transparent people we have out there. His whole thing was, we're just going to tell people the truth and be honest with them with what we know. So our first one was, hey, we've had a cyber incident. We don't know the impact. Second one was, hey, we've had a cyber incident. Here's the impact. Third one was, hey, our services are now coming back online. We're going to release information as we find out and as things come to light. There was also some decision-making about what public services restored first. Now, I have to be clear that most of these are not IT decisions. They occur at management and executive levels. However, the general guiding principle is work on things that have life safety impact first. So that's fire, water treatment, anything related to enforcement services that directly impact, say, the RCMP. The next thing would be public services. So, trying to do like street sweeping or something like that, the things that we need to do to sort of do the business of the organization. And then everything else is the nice to have. One of the things, and I believe somebody mentioned this actually in one of the other talks, is there is actually a time that your services can run without necessarily having access to their systems. And this is a good thing to know. So for example, street sweepers, well, I'm going to go outside and I'm going to go look, is the street dirty? Yes, then I'm going to clean it. And you don't necessarily need to have a work coordination system for them to survive for a little bit. It's only to the point where they run out of information to do their work that you actually need to go back and say, hey, we need to have this tool up and running now because we have staff who can't do their job. There are other cases where, for example, we have a pool. With a pool, okay, just let people swim for free. The lifeguards can do their work. They don't need a lot of systems to do the life safety work that they do. They sit in the chair and they look and see if anybody's drowning. Cool, they can do that. The thing that we're missing is the ability to take payment. What we want to do is try and maintain a sense of normalcy for our staff and for our residents. And maintaining that sense of normalcy is really important to how people perceive your recovery. So Now I'm going to talk about mitigation. And I've thought about this incident almost every day for the last year. After this occurred, I had to really spend a ton of time thinking like, well, how did this happen? Because if I was going to try and prevent it from in the future for a group that I had literally met less than 48 hours prior, I needed to understand what I needed to do. What I kind of came to the conclusion of is it's really easy to do something like blame this on like a lack of technical controls, or point to something like the factory reset and say, well, this was negligence on the behalf of a single staff member, something like that. It's easy to go, this is the wrong cybersecurity framework. We don't have enough audits. There's not the right technical fixes in places. There's vendor mistakes that were made. How dare they let a 0-day happen, so on and so forth. After a post-mortem review, I don't think that's the right approach. Instead, I'm going to walk you through how we came to the conclusion that culture was actually the major issue. So, oops. Okay. All right, sec here. Here's a list of all the technical, or not all, but some of the technical fixes that the city implemented. You can imagine what's on this. I know what's on it. Everyone really knows what's on this at this point. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has some excellent resources if you want to look at what you need to do. I'm not going to focus on this list. I'm going to focus on culture instead. My thinking goes something like this. Ransomware is a sin of omission. It occurs because of what you didn't do as opposed to what you did do or a mistake you made. My staff are generally smart, intelligent, competent people. They knew what they were supposed to do. They got hit because those things hadn't been done. So the real problem is, how do you get competent people who know what's on this list to go do the things on this list? We had technical controls in theory. Previous IT managers had worked through cybersecurity frameworks and had policies in place. The staff are smart, competent people, like I mentioned. Everyone should know what they should do. They should be able to follow the policies. We should be able to understand what we need to do. We had decent tooling in place in theory. In practice, my diagnosis ended up being in culture, because when I looked at everything, I was like, well, what best explains why we're not doing this? Well, if it's not our cybersecurity policies, if it's not our frameworks, if it's not our tooling, if it's not our people, it's got to be something with the culture. The reason for this is partially because of my background. Prior to working in the city, I worked in construction in major infrastructure, and I tend to think about security incidents the same way we think about safety incidents. Whenever you think about a safety incident, culture is a major part of that conversation, because we recognize just telling a staff member like, hey, go out today and go be safe, isn't sufficient for good reason. It doesn't convey everything they need to know, and it doesn't convey sufficient motivation for them to do that. We have comprehensive safety programs because we recognize that almost all safety incidents start because of a series of systemic safety factors that lead to the incident, not because of just plain simple negligence on behalf of an employee. I want to reiterate that what leads to a ransomware attack is sort of the permissible conditions. Ransomware gangs are not nation state actors. Most of them don't even have the toolkits to qualify as like advanced persistent threats. They are sort of drive-by people looking for easy scores, and they're going to go after you because you're easy, and the permit or the setting that you have is permissible for them to do their work. And if we know that we need to deny them permissible conditions, why didn't we do that? So that brings me to some of the major themes of the city's cyber attack and the sort of work we did to stop this in the future. If you take nothing else away from this, these are the three major contributing factors that I and my team discovered as contributing to the attack. First, the city experienced configuration drift. We had security policies in place, but we made day-to-day exceptions to those policies, and we didn't manage them properly. We didn't manage them properly because many of the processes to manage them properly were either too onerous or too difficult for the actual knowledge workers, the sharp end of the stick, to follow and still feel like they were able to do their jobs or meet the expectations the organization had of them. Second, there was an issue of project tempo. The city had an existing security modernization initiative, and we were going through things like MFA and Zero Trust. And like on my first day, I was told, hey, part of the reason why you've been brought on is because we know cybersecurity is an area we don't do well in, and we want you to fix things. However, perfection was being prioritized over implementation. IT was allowing the business and users and everybody else to put up a lot of very high barriers to technical discomfort. Things like MFA were treated as too hard, and IT was told, hey, you have to treat everybody, IT believed that we had to treat everybody with kids' gloves to get them to go through these processes. Because we let them dictate the pace of the rollout based on their comfort level, we were moving very, very, very slow. Now, obviously, any go-to organization lets the business units have a say in the running of the organization. However, we had the organizational and social capital to cash in. The business had made us stewards of good security and would have backed us had we said, hey, we know this is going to be hard, but it was our own unwillingness to put our foot down that was part of the problem. Finally, we had an issue of defense in depth. If for any of you familiar with the Swiss cheese model of safety, the holes just lined up and the attacker was able to go straight through. I'm going to be upfront that a lot of what I'm about to talk about is straight up stolen from guys like James Reason and Sidney Decker. There's a reading list here. If you're going to pick any one of these out of here, a field guide to human error is very good. The other one is a Challenger launch, or the Challenger launch decision, to talk about how that happened. The back of the Challenger launch decision book has a snippet on it that's going to sound awfully familiar. Why did NASA managers, who had not only had all the information prior to the launch, but also were warned against the launch, proceed with it? The echo of this for us is, why did a competent IT team who knew what they needed to do not do those things? I see a lot of parallels in that. What we started with was something called a blameless postmortem. The investigation started with the idea that we're not going to sit out in here and go, who is at fault? What we need to do is look and say, what are the systemic factors that led to this incident occurring? The problem that I found over my career is that punishment resulting from who is to blame almost never works, because it's a short-term deterrent. It will modify behavior, but it then breaks long-term trust. I want to take a page out of a blog post from Etsy where they talk about this. It's interesting to note. So they go, an engineer who thinks they're going to be reprimanded are disincentivized to give the details necessary to get an understanding of the mechanism, pathology, and operation of a failure. This lack of understanding of how the accident occurred all but guarantees that it'll repeat. This whole point of a blameless postmortem isn't to be kind or to avoid accountability. What I'm trying to do is avoiding actions which will discourage my staff from giving me the information I need to be able to address the problem. And the reason why is, like, how often does this cycle sound familiar to you guys? You or your staff do something wrong. You or your staff get punished. You or your staff don't want to get punished again. So you decide that you're just going to quietly fix the issue to the point where you or your staff have covered their own behinds, and then you're going to shut up about it and never speak about the issue again. And then it happens again, and rinse and repeat. This is the cycle that I wanted to break, because if we come back and say, hey, we're going to start talking about accountability and heads are going to roll, people are going to not tell me what they did, or more importantly, didn't do, that led to this attack occurring. So to break this cycle, and I'm going to paraphrase Etsy here, we want the person who made the mistake to give details about what they did, why it made sense to them at the time, or in our case, what they didn't do and why they didn't feel they needed to do it, so that we can understand how we can make them do that thing in the future and make it make sense that they think, yes, I have to do this. I needed my staff to give me those details so I could have a genuine understanding of the factors that led to the ransomware attack occurring, because otherwise I wasn't going to know, how do I prevent this in the future? The tricky thing is that this is a result of inaction, not of necessarily of specific mistakes. I want to emphasize here that the attitude that I have is, what I'm trying to figure out primarily is the behaviors that they have, not necessarily the outcome. What I want to do is judge people on the basis of what a competent peer would do, and then when they deviate from that, either hold them accountable for that basis if I think it's genuine negligence, or ask themselves, what is the difference between what that competent peer would do and what they would do, and are there systemic factors to lead them to make that different decision? One of the biggest things that we took away from this is that we had normalized what I'm going to call deviance. So how much of this sounds familiar to you guys? You have a risky condition, you know it exists, you've probably known about it for so long that you've forgotten about it. Eventually you begin to think, hey, this hasn't bit me in the butt yet, so it's probably not that big of a deal. And the definition of what's acceptable keeps moving, because every time you want to push to get your security baselines back in order, people point to all the exceptions you've made everywhere else and been like, well, it's okay over there, so if it's okay over there, it has to be okay over here. For those of you unfamiliar with the Challenger disaster, the root cause of the shuttle unfortunately exploding and losing the lives of the astronauts was because of brittle O-rings that were inside the shuttle. They became brittle because of the cold weather. Over many previous shuttle launches, NASA had observed, in fact, that the O-rings were getting damaged, and they were being damaged in a way that the original specifications shouldn't happen. Each time, the engineers would go and analyze the damage, conclude that it was, well, this is something we can tolerate. It's not actually that big of a deal. And then they'd fly again and again and again. Each subsequent launch with damage became evidence that this level of damage was normal and safe because nothing bad had happened yet. I'm hesitant to come down hard on people most of the time because I generally think most people are good, reasonable people. What I do push hard on is to make sure that things like baselines aren't broken, because that prevents the attitude of nothing bad has happened yet, so it's acceptable to break the baseline. These baselines have to be very clear. They have to be something easy to understand, like we do not use manufacturer passwords. Once I have that easy baseline, I try to get them to internalize that idea, and so that they are able to themselves look and say, if I make temporary changes, there is a very good reason why I have to go put them back to the way that they're done, so that they're intrinsically motivated to adhere to the baseline. Then I need to make sure that they understand that this is our definition of what is secure, and that this is a normal expectation, and that it is not acceptable to deviate from this. So the critical thing is to not really be punitive with this, but more to make sure that they understand and accept the internal reasoning for the reason why this is very, very important. And then to bring on the sort of harder end of saying, like, and this is an expectation management has, and you will face certain consequences if you don't stick to those baselines. You have to remember that for NASA, each step in their chain was logically reasonable. The flaw was systemic. No one was taking the time to say, hey, stop, our standards have moved and we need to reset them. This is one of the key messages I want you guys to take away, is you can be gentle about mistakes, but you need to be rigid about your standards. The other thing that I discovered is that my people, to hopefully nobody's surprise, are genuinely nice and smart people. They're not malicious. If they genuinely were malicious, I should have fired them already. I trust that nobody on my team is thinking, I need to leave us vulnerable to ransomware. We're typically conditioned when we think of audit and controls to think of people as our weakest links. There's a value to that, but I don't know if I agree fully, because I also recognize that people are just intelligence agents responding to the conditions they find themselves in. What I've noticed is that throughout their day, they were thinking things like, there's other work that I have that's more important, or implementing security controls is really hard and the stress isn't worth it, or I'm afraid to make a change without approval and I don't feel comfortable asking for approval, or I just genuinely don't know what I don't know. Those were the risk factors that I came to the conclusion that I really needed to address within the team, because if they know what to do and it's easy for them to do it and they understand the intrinsic value of what it is, they will then do that work. So given that, I needed to change how these people felt about their environment. What I needed them to do is to feel responsible for something instead of just being told that they're responsible for it. I did that by explaining these are the impacts of the systems we have. This is what it means to the residents, and to sort of bring them around the organization and say, like, this is the actual work that you do. The things that you do looking at a screen that impact the systems for everybody else. Yes, that's the mechanism of what you do, but the actual work you do is the kid laughing on the soccer field, or the clean drinking water, or the house that gets responded to with a fire. That's the real work that the city does. One of the things they struggled with was that every time they would go to do security work, they would then get sidetracked with some non-security project mandated by management. And really, I, as their manager, shouldn't be surprised when the security work isn't done, because every time they've gone to go do it, I've said, like, actually, what I need you to do is work on this recreation system, or I need to go work on this or something else like that. They take away the subtle hint that actually security is really not that important. It's these other things that are important, and I'm not going to do the security work. The other thing I needed to do is create psychological safety for them to do security work. We all know that security work can be a pain in the butt. MFA is a pain, PIM is a pain, least privilege is a pain. It inconveniences users, it inconveniences peer managers, it inconveniences the C-suite, public, the council, even the staff themselves. I needed to be the one to take the brunt of the heat from the organization, so the analysts who do the work feel that they are secure and psychologically safe to do the work, and that they're not going to have to suffer consequences for doing the things that they know that they should have to do. I also really tried to give them the language and tools to justify themselves if they ever were cornered about, hey, why do I have to have MFA? This is really a pain, I don't like it. And the reason why is because if they are able to speak the language of risk clearly and articulate why their actions matter, both for their own knowledge of the knowledge of others, then they will internalize those values and go, yes, this is the reason why I have to do this security work. So this one is, I have to be able to put a little bit of caveating in front of this because this can be easily misinterpreted as Eric doesn't like audits and Eric's just saying, don't fill out risk registers, just go make changes willy-nilly. That's not what I'm trying to get at. This is more of a sort of frontline intervention I had to put in place because we were stuck in process. A lot of things were done because it was like, well, if I want to make this change, I'm going to have to go get a whole bunch of approvals. I'm going to have to fill a whole bunch of paperwork. And like, I don't really have time to do that with all the other things that you're putting on me. So I'm just not going to do it. This is also something that you may not be able to do, and it's not intended as a prescription for everybody here. This is just an explanation of a lever that I use to try and get the organization from inaction to action. You may have a council that is incredibly risk adverse. Ours is moderately so. You may have a CAO or a C-level or something who are incredibly risk adverse. Ours are generally willing to listen to us and defer to our judgment on risk. You may have stricter compliance mandates. You may have auditors who aren't understanding. There are a series of systemic factors outside that let me do this specific thing that may not apply to you. This is just a thing that works for me. It is not intended as a critique of anybody else's practices. So with all that caveating being said, we adopted a fail fast, fail often approach. And then the caveat we added at the end of it was fail safety after the first few times it bit us. And we're like, maybe we do need to slow down a little bit. What I mean by this is we actively try to remove the cultural and structural barriers to prevent people from making changes. We've adopted this because it helped remove the decision-making paralysis that staff would often feel. They often felt like they knew what to do, but didn't feel like the culture at the city permitted them or protected them from moving quickly to address the real issues. And the time from them identifying the issue to the time implementing it, the further out that got, the less likely they were to do it. Now, none of this is an excuse to not do boring paperwork. That still needs to happen. However, what we went to them and said is basically something like this. You need to start thinking, stop thinking, if I break something, I'll never hear the end of it, and then spend twice as long second guessing yourself and second guessing every action so that when you do finally execute, it's perfect. We wanted them to not think, okay, if I sit on this vulnerability fix or delay it, is this going to get me out of having to do this really onerous change management process or filling out a whole bunch of paperwork that I don't want to fill out, even though I know the actual configuration change that makes it safe is going to take a few seconds? We wanted them to get away from that. Instead, we wanted to think something like, if I'm going to implement something big like network segmentation, sure, it might break something, but I'm going to trust that I can fix it. I'm going to trust that the organization understands why I did what I did. I'm going to trust that we have a bunch of tools in place to get me out of hot water, and I'm going to go take the risk and implement it anyway. What this looks like in practice is we invested in mechanisms that allow us to make recoveries fast, things like rollback mechanisms, things like automatic snapshotting of configuration states of routers, various versions of immutable backups and immutable infrastructure. So we know even if I totally botch things, the organization is going to be okay and we can restore. This was things like putting in version control, but a really easy system of version control so that, hey, you made a change to a script, you're just going to do a git commit. You're not going to have to think about like, where do I copy this file and I got to bring it over here and that sort of thing. It also meant paring down our documentation so that when a technician goes to do the actual work of something, it's really it's quick for them to fill out the documentation, go, cool, I've done this thing, and then get to the work, as opposed to like, I'm going to consider 600 different things before I say, hey, I'm now ready to execute the change. Critically, it also meant giving them some autonomy to act. The idea is trusting that if they have a clear technical recovery path, that is safe, and it's something where they shouldn't fear doing things like implementing patches and wanting something like a golden signature for me to say that I've signed off and they're good to do, because ultimately the patch is what protects the organization, not my signature. So as for a conclusion for all of this, I'm just a dude trying to do my job well. I don't have some sage insight to the world that any of you don't. I'm just a guy. I've learned from other people, and I'm honestly making a guess at the things I think will work for my team and my organization in the future. If you're a security leader here and you want any single lesson to take away from this, the thing that I'd ask you to consider is that your culture doesn't have to be some monolithic thing that exists until the end of time. If you feel like things aren't working, change it. Many of the things that we're doing now, especially when we get to the fail fast, fail often stuff, is not sustainable in the long term. We recognize that. It is a specific tool designed for dislodging a team stuck in a very specific pathology. It's not a prescription for how you should run your department. Some of that will remain, but much of it won't. However, what I've gotten them to recognize now is that they've changed their culture once. We know we can do it again in the future. When we get to the point where we're more compliance focused and back in the documentation train and more focused on frameworks and everything like that, we recognize we can shift back into that because we've been there before. However, this time we recognize we know what the blind spots of that are. We know how this caught us last time, and we know that we have a tool in place and a lever that we can pull out and say, hey, this culture is not working for us anymore. We're going to shove the lever in, we're going to unlodge ourselves, get unstuck, and go back to doing the security work again. There's probably a day where old will become new again. Once we've gotten stuck, we're going to pull out the lever. The cycle's going to repeat. We're going to be like, you know what? We've gotten a little too reckless here. We need to go back to being more prim and proper. Slow down again. Cycle's going to repeat. Lever's going to come out. Things will speed up. I think that ultimately one of the things the city did tried too hard to do was become this sort of single static state of culture where everything is perfect. We kind of viewed everything as a sort of maturity model. It's like, once we get mature, then we're good. I don't know if that's ever going to happen. And I don't necessarily know that that's the way businesses work. I think what we might need to do at some point is accept that this is going to be cyclical. There's going to be natural ebbs and flows, like how often we are very focused on documentation versus how often we are very focused on, say, implementation or getting security work done. And I think the idea is, instead of trying to fight these two ideas, I think what we need to do is try and say we need to avoid the extremes and be okay oscillating between those two different points. Maybe I'm wrong. Don't take what I say as gospel. I'm just a guy who suffered a ransomware attack on my second day at work. That's all I've got for you guys today. I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Wow. Just wow. I did not know that happened on your second day of work. So kudos to you for coming through and still appearing to be relatively sane.
I don't know. It's one of those things where I recognize I'm in a very privileged position because it's my second day of work. I don't have as much ego tied into it as, say, people who've been in the organization for a long time. But it was genuinely a shock of like,
oh,
this is gonna be rough.
oh, welcome to your job. Although, I mean, I'm betting your performance review was really great. First one.
It was very, very great. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for being so clear about what happened and how you were, in a sense, lucky, and that there is no magic bullet for that. I'm curious if you find that you have more support from senior leadership now that you have survived this and they have seen what the ramifications are.
Yeah.
Or do you find that there's still pushback? Like, is it better now that they've lived through it?
So I think one of the hard things is, prior to it, IT had a lot of capital that they just weren't willing to cash in on. And we should have been using that social and political capital more. So it's less that we necessarily gained a whole bunch, and probably more we are now reaping the benefits of the benefits that were already there. Not necessarily so much with senior leadership. With other peer departments, it's a lot easier. So when we go to, say, the recreation department, and they're like, well, I don't understand why I'm having to do this, it's a lot easier to explain it to them in that language. Because we go, hey, you remember when all the services were down for a week? That's the reason why we're doing this thing, to stop that in the future. And they go, oh, okay, I understand. Senior leadership, like, we're fairly fortunate. They're very, not necessarily like tech savvy, but they trust us. And so them, not so much, but other peers, definitely.
Can I ask you what the size of your team is?
So we are 7 at the moment. We're going to 8.
Wow. And of those 8, eventual 8, how many of them do you have roles that are purely cybersecurity?
0.
Yeah.
So, and part of, like, there's a bunch of other, like, minor contributing factors. One was ownership. Like, when you have everyone in their job descriptions who's direct on hands keyboard IT person had something in their job description that says, like, you're responsible for implementing cybersecurity best practices and knowing what they are. But if everybody is responsible for it, nobody's responsible for it. And one of the things we've had to very clearly do is lay out, okay, sysadmins, you guys are going to be our on-point people for these cybersecurity roles, and this is going to be job number one. And we've had to explain it in the same terms we explain safety. So, for instance, when we talk to employees about safety, we don't say like, well, you're here as a say a utilities worker, and safety is like the responsibility of somebody. It's like, no, safety is a foundational component of the type of work you do, and it
Yeah.
has to be part of how you think about everything. It's not some optional extra.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's fundamental right there, that it is, we've talked about this cybersecurity as a team sport, and you need support internal to your team and external as well. It's uh it's a tough thing to deal with. I'm curious if you have you done a presentation to your council about what happened, or a training
Yep.
session with council about like how to think about this in the aftermath?
We did we included council in it, but when everything was done, the city did a public postmortem to about an audience of 300-ish, which was school
Wow.
boards, nearby municipalities, interested members of the public, and the council, explaining exactly what happened. I'm very fortunate that Milo, our CAO, is very big on transparency, and so I can talk about these things very freely.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was the sort of formal thing to council, and it was nice because council now knows the exact same thing that we know, which is also the same thing the public knows.
Yeah. No, that's a huge advantage actually. Working with a leader that appreciates that is gold. Paul is asking if you're hiring a SOC/DFIR specialist.
We have a third-party SOC retained now. So one of the
Oh,
interesting things is we did have like EDR in place, and it was interesting that the tooling picked nothing up. So
yeah.
So now we
Yeah.
have SOC, and we have more of an emphasis on monitoring behavior as opposed to just what the tooling says.
Yeah. Paul's crying now, by the way,
Yeah,
just so you know.
I see that.
Do you have any insights or takeaways around the cyber insurance incident response, part of what happened with you, about the value of it, how key it was to what you were doing and your response?
So the biggest thing with incident response is when you're on a team like ours, everybody has sort of security adjacent knowledge, and we all kind of like know roughly, but you don't, and you can have like what's the word I'm looking for? You can have a playbook, but ultimately it's experience dealing with these issues over and over again that teach you when you can deviate from the playbook and when you have to. So, for example, like our playbook talks about, well, we have to restore from the backups and we're going to do that kind of thing. And we had this very lovely guy named George who's like, yeah, I deal with a new ransomware incident every other day. And he's like, no, you're not going to restore from your backups. We can't trust them. I'm trying to do a Southern accent, which I don't want to do to the embarrassing level that he has. But he's like, no, that ain't the way it's going to
No.
go. You're going to go restore the descriptor files because I guarantee they ain't been compromised. And it was having that experience and that knowledge
Wow.
available to us that we wouldn't necessarily have because ideally we aren't dealing with ransomware attacks on a daily basis, but George did.
Yeah. Shamil's asking who the cyber insurance provider was and who they brought on for incident response. Are you able to say that?
Oh, no, that's fine. So
No.
we use CFC Underwriting as our general insurance provider. They held our cyber insurance policy. The organization that dealt with the response was CFC Respond. However, CFC Respond subcontracts out a group called Solus Security, and Solus Security are the ones who did the actual incident response for us.
Is that Solus? Is that what
Yeah,
you said? Yeah.
SOLIS Security. They're all typed.
Solus. And you, because you were presenting at MIABC, did you access that cyber insurance provider through MIABC? Through their
Uh,
brokerage?
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
there was a decision made before I got here, so I don't remember how we got
Yeah.
to CFC. So I believe it was through my ABC, but I'm not 100%.
Yeah. They do. I mean, they have a cyber insurance offering, which is kind of key considering all the other things they insure for local governments. That's a big one. So yeah, I see you typed it in there. Thank you. Well, I'm so appreciative of your participation on the panel today and this presentation. I took a lot of notes. Two of my team are on this as well, and I'm sure we're all going to sit around and have the same face that I made in high school when I learned about black holes, which is like, Oh, because there's so much to take in about this, and your lived experience is incredibly valuable. So, with that, thank you, Eric. I'm going to hand us back over to Anthony to close out our session, but really appreciate what you've done for us today.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
I was on mute. There we go. Well, that concludes our local government sector day, biannual local government sector day. Thank you all for joining us. The first session and the third session have been recorded, so eventually they will be on YouTube, and we will send a link to you after once it's on as a follow-up, so you will receive it. Again, thank you very much. We're going to be doing this hopefully in another 6 months, if not earlier. So please stay tuned, and we're looking forward to getting some amazing speakers as we usually do. Thank you, Eric. You were a double player here, and the insights were just fantastic. So really appreciated. Thank you very much, and to all the other panelists as well. All right, thanks everyone.